To start, my name is Rob Moore. I'm the Director of Financial Aid here at Missouri State University. Today, I'm going to give you all an update on some federal items of interest, as well as the FAFSA and FSA ID. Fun fact, it's been about 130 days since I last wore a tie. I tried to match the combo in my headshot on this slide, but unfortunately, I missed the tie, so I do apologize for that. But if we go ahead and go on to the next slide. All right, so to begin with the FSA ID, excuse me. So the FSA ID, we're just going to provide an overview of the ID as well as the FAFSA. Unfortunately, the FAFSA itself for the 2021-2022 academic year has not been released for public review or comment. Usually it's out by now, but factors have coalesced to unfortunately delay that process. But this will be a good overview just to kind of give a feel for what that process looks like and some tips for your students. So to begin with, what is the FSA ID? Well, the ID is a user-created username and password, and it's actually required for all students, parents, and borrowers to authenticate their identity and access their federal student aid information online. So different Department of Education websites and portals, such as FAFSA.gov, the My Student Aid mobile app, studentloans.gov, and the NSLDS Student Access portal, all require an FSA ID to log in. So if a student needs to provide parent information on the FAFSA, one of those parents or legal guardians will also need to obtain an FSA ID in order to sign the form. The parent can create the FSA ID in the same manner that the student creates theirs and then sign the FAFSA form electronically using that ID. If a student is not sure whether or not they need to provide their parent information on the FAFSA, they can log into studentaid.gov/dependency, and it'll help walk them through whether or not that information will be required. So there were some enhancements made to the FSA ID process that will hopefully make it a little bit of a simpler process for the students. So to begin, students can now log in with a verified mobile phone number in lieu of just their user ID. So that'll help a lot of students who may have forgotten what ID they created when they set up their FSA ID account, as long as they keep that same phone number. In order to take advantage of this option, the user must first register his or her mobile phone number on the FSA ID website if they've not already done so. Next is that the system will warn users if they enter an email address that they will likely lose access to. So this warning will appear if a student tries to use student or parent tries to use an email address with an extension type of .edu, .k12, or something like that, that they could potentially lose access to as a result of leaving an educational institution. The system has also removed the 18-month password update requirement, and it will only prompt users to update their password if there's been a security event of some type. The system has also removed the requirement to have a special character in the password. However, special characters are still able to be used if the user so chooses. And then finally, the system will warn users when they're nearing too many login attempts on their account before the account is actually frozen and locked out. So some FSA ID tips that would be useful to make sure students are aware of is, first of all, make sure the students verify their phone number and email address as quickly as possible. This is the easiest and fastest way for a student to retrieve lost or forgotten information. And so if the student has that already verified, it speeds up that process. If they answer a security question to regain access because of a forgotten password, they can still do so, but they'll need to wait 30 minutes before logging in to reset the password. So if they have a verified phone number or email, it'll send a confirmation number to that verified number or email that the student can then use to access their account. Again, the phone number can be verified, or the email can be verified by logging in with the FSA ID, going to the personal information page, and following the prompts to verify that information. It's also very important to keep your account information up to date. So if a student changes their address, phone number, or email, they'll be prompted to keep that contact information updated on both the FSA ID page as well as the FAFSA form itself. There are two different places where they'll need to update that information, and it's important they remember to do so on both of those portals. only the user or the owner of the FSA ID should create and use the account. This may seem obvious, but if a parent creates an account for a student or vice versa, oftentimes in the financial aid community, we see where that user enters their own information for the student or the parent. This can prove problematic for the owner of that ID. So it's best to treat these types of login credentials as you would with any kind of bank information. Keep it to yourself, try not to write it down, don't share it with anyone, including parents, teachers, advisors, folks like that. Users must be at least 13 years of age to have an FSA ID. So we know that we have some very excited younger students, but they do need to wait before they create that account. And then also a user may choose to disable their FSA ID if they know they won't be using it for a while, which is a great security option. In order to do so, all they need to do is log in with their FSA ID, go to the security settings, and they'll be prompted with how to proceed. So some FAFSA updates, just to, again, this is going to be using 2020-2021 FAFSA information because the FAFSA that will be available October 1st has not yet been released for review. But to begin, there is a new web location for the FAFSA on the web. No longer is it FAFSA.gov or FAFSA.ed.gov. Now the FAFSA form is housed on studentaid.gov. Now, if a user enters FAFSA.gov or FAFSA.ed.gov, they'll automatically be forwarded to the new website, but it's good to get in the habit of using the correct URL when logging in. The FAFSA on the web portal is now mobile friendly, and so completers can utilize the My Student Aid app, but if they choose to complete FAFSA on the web, it should work on their mobile phone pretty well. And then finally, the My Student Aid mobile app has been updated to be more user friendly and then allow users with more functionality. So some updates that we saw on the FAFSA form, again, this is for the 2021 FAFSA. It's been updated to reflect changes that occurred in the 2018 IRS tax forms. So questions have been modified to remove references to IRS forms 1040A or EZ. So all tax filers now file 1040s, and the only differentiation is the type of schedules that we file with our tax return. So the FAFSA has been updated to exclude language that pertains to any forms other than the 1040, and instead directs applicants to the various IRS schedules that might accompany their return. Questions were modified to address updated automatic zero and simplified needs test EFC calculations. IRS forms 1040NR and 1040NR-EZ were added to the foreign tax return response. Questions about exemptions were removed. The IRS combined untaxed portions of the IRA distributions and untaxed pensions and annuities on the IRS forms, but then fortunately there were no changes to the IRS data retrieval process. We will hopefully see some of these similarities when the 2021-2022 FAFSA is released. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you all kind of an expectation of what the timeline should have been. In previous years, draft versions of the FAFSA were generally made available in mid to late April for the community to review, prepare for, kind of get our feet wet with the new form. But due to COVID-19 and other factors that were going on, we have not yet been provided with a draft version of the 2021-2022 FAFSA. There have been some glimpses of what the form will look like and what questions may be through technical reference material that's been released, like the ICER guide, but we don't actually have the FAFSA form in our hands. And as of a June 24th communication with the Department of Education, I confirmed that they don't have the draft version available and they are uncertain when it will be available, though they are confident that the FAFSA will be available October 1st, 2020. So now for some federal updates. To begin with, reauthorization is dead, unfortunately, at least for this calendar year. So the Higher Education Act of 1965 is the law that governs most all federal financial aid and funding priorities. And by statute, this law must be reviewed and updated every 4 to 5 years. Unfortunately, over the years, this time frame has slipped as legislators have politicized the process and been unable to maintain discipline for on-time completion. So HEA, or Higher Education Act, was last reauthorized in 2008 and has been maintained through extensions since that last reauthorization. Currently, there's not enough time on the congressional calendar to reauthorize HEA. If we were to assume that Congress were functioning properly on a good calendar and without any competing issues, it would still take about 6 to 9 months to get everything in place needed to pass a strong reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Unfortunately, again, the current congressional calendar is simply too short to get this completed on time. A lot of work has actually been done, taken out, but the Senate committee working on this reached an impasse, and now Democrats are holding firm, hoping that they will gain control of the Senate and could possibly drive more content in reauthorization after the November elections. And speaking of the elections, even if there weren't enough time to get reauthorization completed, as we approach the November presidential election, we're now seeing national political strategy impact Congress on both sides of the aisle. Both Democrats and Republicans are very careful to introduce legislation that is particularly helpful to their candidate or their particular platform, which is not always what's in the best interest for long-term bipartisan legislation. Additionally, Senator Alexander is retiring. If calendar and election considerations weren't enough to kill any chances of reauthorization, the most senior member of the Senate who is passionate about this and has the gravitas to move a bill like reauthorization forward has announced his retirement. Next is that we will see some small bills that could pass. Unfortunately, this seems to be a troubling habit that Congress has developed over the past 20 years or so, and a growing tendency to pass smaller bills that focus on small issues that would normally be wrapped up into a larger, more complete reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. While these small bills may seem like progress, when Congress does this, we actually lose leverage that is necessary to promote strong compromise when negotiating a larger, more complex bill like the Higher Education Act. Congress loses their motivation and leverage to get reauthorization completed when these smaller pet projects can get taken care of and the more arduous and contentious items can be left on the sidelines. In the past, Congress would use these smaller issues in negotiation processes so that we could move all items forward, but this unfortunate trend is expected to continue. Next stimulus bill is here. If you haven't already heard, the Senate has released their version of the next stimulus bill. Depending on how you're counting, this is either bill number 3.5 or 4.0. And with many provisions in the CARES Act set to expire July 31st, although some provisions may have already expired, it's highly unlikely that this next stimulus bill will get done before many provisions have actually ended. Congress is set to leave Washington after August 7th, and unless they change the congressional calendar and stay in D.C. to work on the compromise bill between the House and the Senate. As such, many now believe that a final stimulus 4.0 bill may not be fully completed until sometime in September, though again, everything is up in the air. So unless conference committee stays through August to work on hammering out the differences of the bills, we may see a little bit of a delay there. The two version 4 stimulus bills through the House and Senate are noticeably different first off by their price tag. The House bill is around $3 trillion and the Senate bill is about $1 trillion. Conventional wisdom here is that the price tag will end up somewhere in the middle, depending on how negotiations proceed. These bills are still being reviewed for content, but the Senate priority seems to be on the employer liability protections to ensure a company does not go out of business through litigation if an employee contracts COVID-19, and the House priority seems to be to get more funds to those states with budgets that have been negatively impacted from COVID-19. So expect more information out there in the near future. And then finally, other items. There are always other items when discussing legislation in the Congress in D.C. this year. It is presidential elections. While it is interesting to see how the House and Senate will work together to iron out the next stimulus package and how this impacts all of us and the students we serve, this is an election year. But of note is if the executive branch happens to have a few priorities that are not included in the stimulus bill, the president might be able to leverage use of presidential order to enact other stimulus provisions. While this power is intentionally broad, there are rules that govern the use of presidential order, so we'll all have to stay tuned as the process continues. And that ends my presentation.